In a quiet suburban neighborhood, the sight of an American flag waving proudly outside one family's home should have been nothing unusual. But in this community, it sparked a firestorm. The Homeowners Association sent a letter demanding the flag's removal, citing aesthetic violations. What they didn't expect was that the homeowner's father wasn't just any retiree. He was a respected federal judge, a man who spent his life defending the very freedoms that flag represented. What started as a petty HOA complaint would soon spiral into a national story of power, pride, and payback. This wasn't just about fabric on a pole. It was about identity, legacy, and a fight against small-minded authority. By the time it was over, neighbors, lawyers, and even the media would be watching closely. But the HOA had no idea what storm they had just unleashed. The trouble began on a warm June morning in suburban Virginia. Marcus Johnson, a middle-aged black homeowner with deep military roots in his family, had placed a sturdy flagpole in his front yard. To him, the flag was more than decoration. It was a symbol of his father's lifelong service as a federal judge and a reminder of the sacrifices made by countless black Americans who fought for freedoms that were often denied to them. The Johnson family had lived in the neighborhood for nearly a decade without major conflict. They paid their dues on time, kept their yard tidy, and rarely caused trouble. But the flag changed everything. Within a week, Marcus received a letter from the HOA stating that the flag violated community uniformity standards and must be removed immediately. The letter was sharp, cold, and backed with the threat of daily fines. At first, Marcus laughed it off. Flying the flag was a federally protected right, and surely the HOA knew that. But when the fines began arriving, $50 per day, escalating quickly, his smile faded. What began as annoyance grew into grief. He felt disrespected, not only as a homeowner but also as an American. His father, Judge Samuel Johnson, had spent decades defending constitutional rights in courtrooms across the nation, and now in the quiet cul-de-sac, where he had hoped to retire peacefully, that very symbol of justice was being targeted. Marcus's wife tried to calm him, suggesting they appeal politely, but Marcus could feel the weight of something larger. For years, black families like his had struggled to carve out space in suburban neighborhoods where their presence wasn't always welcome. To the HOA, maybe this was just a rule, but to Marcus, it felt like an attack, a reminder that even in his own home, his expression of pride could be silenced. As the letters piled up and the fines grew, Marcus realized the HOA wasn't going to back down. His neighbors whispered, some quietly supporting him, others siding with the board. What was once a peaceful street now felt divided, each glance charged with tension. And in the middle of it all, Marcus knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. His father, the man who had spent his life on the bench defending rights like this, had to know. The moment Marcus picked up the phone to call him, the story shifted from a neighborhood dispute to something much bigger. When Marcus dialed his father's number, his hands trembled slightly. Judge Samuel Johnson was a man of few words but immense presence. To Marcus, he was more than a father. He was a symbol of strength, the embodiment of resilience. Samuel had grown up in the Jim Crow South, worked his way through law school, and spent decades on the federal bench defending civil rights cases that shaped history. He had taught Marcus that freedom wasn't just given, it was fought for. A's. Soon as Marcus explained the situation, the judge went quiet. There was no sigh, no outrage, just silence, the kind that meant he was thinking carefully. Finally, in a steady voice, he said, "Son, this isn't about a flag. This is about power. And power must always be challenged." The next morning, Samuel drove into the neighborhood. At 76, he moved with deliberate steps, his sharp suit and calm authority commanding attention. Some neighbors recognized him immediately, others whispered as he passed. By noon, Samuel was seated across from the HOA board in their small office, the same letter about aesthetic violations spread out before him. The board president, a middle-aged man with a stiff smile, tried to maintain his composure. He spoke about community standards and uniform guidelines, but Samuel interrupted with a voice honed from decades on the bench. He reminded them that Congress had passed laws protecting the right to display the American flag on residential property. He cited federal statutes word for word, his voice unwavering. What the HOA thought would be a routine enforcement meeting quickly shifted into something else. The room grew tense. Board members exchanged nervous glances. For the first time, they realized this wasn't just Marcus against the HOA. It was a federal judge dismantling their arguments point by point. But Samuel wasn't finished. He leaned forward and told them in no uncertain terms that if the HOA's fines against his son continued, they would not only face a lawsuit, but also the full weight of federal scrutiny. His words were measured, but they carried the weight of authority that came from decades in courtrooms where the stakes were life-changing. The board president swallowed hard, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. He claimed that exceptions could not be made, that rules must apply equally to everyone. Samuel raised an eyebrow. He had seen this tactic before. The rigid enforcement of petty rules, always applied most harshly when it involved families like his own. By the time Samuel and Marcus left the meeting, one thing was clear. The HOA wasn't going to yield easily. If anything, the confrontation had hardened their resolve, and that meant the battle was only beginning. Word traveled quickly through the subdivision. Some neighbors applauded Marcus for standing up to the HOA, whispering that they too felt bullied by constant fines and arbitrary rules. Others, however, fell in line with the board, muttering that Marcus was stirring up trouble and bringing unnecessary drama into what they believed was a peaceful community. The flagpole in Marcus's yard, once a quiet symbol of pride, now stood as a lightning rod. Every car that passed slowed down. Some drivers gave nods of encouragement, others scowled openly. Children asked their parents why the Johnsons' house had become the center of neighborhood gossip. Marcus felt the tension tighten like a noose around his family's daily life. The HOA escalated its campaign. New violation notices appeared on Marcus's door, complaints about the height of his grass, the color of his shutters, and even the placement of his trash cans. It was clear these were not coincidences, but targeted harassment. The message was simple: comply or be crushed under the weight of fines. But Marcus wasn't alone. A handful of neighbors, mostly younger families and a few older veterans, began quietly voicing support. One Vietnam veteran stopped Marcus on his evening walk and shook his hand, saying, "That flag belongs to all of us. Don't let them. Take it down." Meanwhile, the HOA board met behind closed doors, plotting their next move. The president, fueled by pride and stubbornness, argued that bending to Marcus's defiance would open the door for others to challenge authority. He saw Samuel's intervention not as a warning, but as an affront to their control. For him, this was no longer about aesthetics. It was about dominance. The strain seeped into Marcus's home. His wife worried about retaliation. His children, especially his teenage son, struggled with the sudden divide in their community. At school, whispers followed him, classmates repeating what their parents had said at dinner tables. Marcus knew this wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. It was a test of his family's resilience. Then, one morning, Marcus awoke to find his flagpole leaning at an unnatural angle. The bolts securing it to the ground had been loosened. It wasn't an accident. Someone had trespassed onto his property during the night. Rage surged through him, but so did resolve. If the HOA thought intimidation would silence him, they had underestimated just how deeply the flag meant to his family. and to his father's legacy. The battle was no longer confined to letters and meetings. It had spilled into the open, and the neighborhood itself was becoming a battlefield. The morning Marcus discovered his flagpole had been tampered with, something inside him shifted. Grief and humiliation had given way to anger, but now that anger began to harden into resolve. He was done playing defense. If the HOA wanted a battle, then he would give them one they would never forget. Samuel, his father, wasted no time. With decades of legal experience and the weight of his title as a federal judge, he knew the HOA had crossed into dangerous territory. Tampering with private property, issuing retaliatory fines, and attempting to restrict the display of the American flag weren't just petty grievances, they were legal violations. Samuel began pulling statutes, case precedents, and federal protections that guaranteed citizens the right to fly the flag. At the dinner table, Marcus listened as his father laid out the strategy. "They're counting on intimidation," Samuel explained, "but intimidation collapses when exposed to the law. We'll show them they've picked the wrong family." Marcus wasn't content with quiet paperwork. He started documenting every single notice, every fine and every suspicious act of vandalism. He purchased cameras to monitor his property, ensuring there would be no more anonymous attacks in the night. He photographed the leaning flagpole, the threatening notes slipped under his door, and even the meetings where HOA members mocked him publicly. Every detail became part of a growing case file. The neighbors who supported Marcus grew bolder. A few began to attend HOA meetings just to voice their disapproval of the board's heavy-handedness. Some even started placing small flags in their own yards, subtle gestures of solidarity that sent a quiet but powerful message. Marcus wasn't alone anymore. The board, however, doubled down. They issued threats of liens against Marcus's home, warning that unpaid fines would be collected through property seizure. They believed that threatening his livelihood would force him into submission. But in doing so, they handed Marcus and Samuel the very proof they needed, that this wasn't about community standards at all, but about abuse of power. As the case file thickened, Samuel reached out to contacts in the media. Local reporters had long covered disputes between HOAs and homeowners, but few had seen a story with this much tension. A black family being targeted for flying the American flag, led by a son with unyielding resolve, and a father with the authority to fight back. The pieces were in motion. Marcus was no longer just reacting to injustice, he was preparing to strike back, and when he did, it wouldn't be in whispers or secret letters. It would be loud, public, and impossible for the HOA to ignore. When the first article appeared in the local newspaper, Marcus almost couldn't believe the sight of his family's story in print. The headline read, "HOA orders black veteran's son to remove American flag." Within hours, the phones started ringing. Neighbors who had never spoken more than a polite hello came by to show support. Strangers across town dropped off small American flags at Marcus's doorstep, planting them in his yard until the lawn became a sea of red, white, and blue. The HOA had wanted to make Marcus an example of obedience, but instead he had become a symbol of resistance. Social media amplified the story. Photos of the vandalized flagpole spread on Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter. Hashtags like #FlagFreedom and #HOAExposed began to trend locally. People were furious, not just at the HOA's overreach, but at the idea of a black family being punished for a simple act of patriotism. National veteran organizations reached out, offering legal support and public platforms. For Marcus, who had grown up hearing his father's stories about serving both the law and the country, this moment felt almost surreal. What had started as grief and humiliation was transforming into empowerment. He wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He was standing up for everyone who had ever been bullied into silence by those hiding behind bylaws and fine print. Meanwhile, Samuel prepared for the next phase. With mounting evidence, media attention, and community support, the HOA's position was collapsing. They could no longer hide behind vague aesthetic standards. Their actions were out in the open, and the public wasn't forgiving. At meetings, board members who once barked threats now faced angry neighbors demanding answers. Some board members began to resign quietly, unwilling to withstand the backlash. The louder the public support grew, the bolder Marcus became. He began attending meetings not just to defend himself, but to advocate for others. Elderly residents fined for minor landscaping issues, single parents harassed over parking disputes. Marcus gave them a voice. He was no longer simply the target of injustice. He had become the rallying point for change. But the board wasn't finished. The remaining members, bitter and cornered, threatened to escalate the legal battle. They filed paperwork to enforce a lien, convinced that the law was still on their side. To them, this was about proving dominance. To Marcus, it was the final confirmation that revenge, real, decisive, and undeniable, was now within reach. The question was no longer if justice would come, but how loud, how public, and how devastating it would be for the HOA once it did. The courtroom was packed. Residents, reporters, and curious onlookers filled every seat, their eyes fixed on Marcus and Samuel as they took their place at the plaintiff's table. The HOA board members sat stiffly across the aisle, their smug confidence now replaced with visible unease. For months they had bullied, fined, and threatened, but now they were about to be judged in front of the very people they claimed to serve. Samuel rose with calm authority. Years of experience as a federal judge gave him a steady presence that commanded the room. He laid out the case with precision: the illegal fines, the retaliatory vandalism, the attempted lien, and, most importantly, the blatant violation of the federal freedom to display the American Flag Act. Each piece of evidence was presented methodically: photographs, letters, video recordings, until the narrative was undeniable. When Marcus spoke, his words carried the weight of lived experience. He described the grief of watching his flag vandalized, the humiliation of fines piling up, and the fear that his family's home could be taken. But he also spoke of resilience, of neighbors planting flags in solidarity, and of the pride he felt standing against injustice. His voice didn't waver, and by the time he finished, the courtroom was silent. The HOA's defense crumbled under scrutiny. Their claims of community standards sounded petty when contrasted with federal law and the overwhelming support Marcus had received. Their threats of property seizure came across as bullying, not governance. Even the judge raised an eyebrow at their justifications, questioning why a homeowners association believed it had the authority to override constitutional rights. When the ruling was read, it wasn't just a victory. It was a complete dismantling of the HOA's power. The court ordered the fines rescinded, the lien voided, and damages paid to Marcus's family for emotional distress and property damage. More importantly, the ruling set a precedent in the state, ensuring no HOA could attempt such overreach again without facing severe consequences. The fallout was swift. Several board members resigned in disgrace. The HOA president, once the loudest critic of Marcus, was removed from his position after residents voted for a new board. For the first time in years, the community felt like it belonged to the people who lived there, not the tyrants who had controlled it. That evening, Marcus raised a brand new flag over his home. This time, it wasn't just a symbol of patriotism, it was a symbol of justice. Neighbors gathered, cheering as the flag unfurled, their voices rising in unity. The HOA had tried to silence one man, but instead, they had awakened an entire community. And as the flag caught the evening breeze, Marcus knew the fight was over. Justice had been delivered. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.